Good morning, and welcome to our hotly awaited discussion on Brazil. Brazil 2020, the privatization agenda. The boom in Brazilian markets over the past year or so has been impressive amid great expectations for economic reform and for a return to growth. While the economic recovery has been perhaps slower than some had expected or hoped, expectations remain high, perhaps nowhere more so than over the privatization program, which itself exceeded expectations in 2019. Its success this year will depend, of course, on investor appetite, and that's one of the things that we will look to interrogate in our discussion this morning. Thankfully, we're joined by, I would say, the leading stars, one might say, of the privatization agenda, and indeed of the financial markets of Brazil. And so we're very grateful to have such an all-star cast with us this morning, taking time out of a very busy schedule to join in this discussion with us. They need little introduction, but I'll introduce them anyway. To my right is Leonardo Cabral, who is the head of privatization at BNDES, the State Development Bank. Leonardo started his career as a management consultant, has also worked in M&A advisory, has also served as head of M&A at Ambev. He was also an advisor to Petrobras for the acquisition and investment department, and has also been a director in M&A at Credit Suisse. To my left is Andrea Marques de Almeida from Petrobras, the Chief Financial Officer and Investor Relations Officer at Petrobras. A production engineer by training, she worked previously for 25 years at Vale in corporate finance, global treasury, and risk management. She was CFO of Vale Canada and Toronto from 2015 to 2018, most recently holding the position of Global Treasury Executive Manager at the company. And to our far left is Raphael Barreau at Engie. He's head of business development, M&A, and financial advisory at the company at Engie in Brazil. And he also serves on the executive committee and is a member of the board of TAG and Engie Brazil Energia. Raphael started his career as a strategy consultant at Accenture and has worked for almost 2 decades developing and financing infrastructure projects across the emerging markets. So we'll get stuck into our discussion, and I think we want to start just by taking a step back to understand where we are today. I mean, clearly the privatization program has been, remains, and will be one of the cornerstones of Brazil's economic agenda. And it's not the first time, of course, that Brazil has sought to sell major state assets, but never on this scale. And it's indeed one of the most ambitious privatization programs that we've seen to date. So I'd like to start with you, Leonardo, just to talk us through a little bit some of the key hallmarks of this agenda, and tell us why, in your opinion, it's more likely to succeed going forward, given the starting point today.
Great. Thank you for the introduction. Thank you all for being here today, for having us here today. Our privatizations agenda, the whole Brazilian government, I'll divide in two. So one thing is state-owned entities like BNDES and Petrobras, for example, that they are carrying on their own agendas and they are related to their own strategies to divest from assets that they no longer consider strategic assets for them. And there's a separate agenda both at national level and at subnational levels, and BNDES in a way takes care of both agendas for national and subnationals that we started to implement last year. Of course, this agenda, first we need to define a strategy and then to actually execute the transactions. I remember that I was actually here in New York a month or a month and a half after I joined the bank. I joined the BNDES last August to run this program. And at that moment, I said three things. First, I'm talking about BNDES only. BNDES has an equities exposure of 120 billion reais, and our shareholders' equity is 100 billion reais. So we thought that this was too much of an equities exposure for a development bank. So what do? We check with all other banks all over the world. Is that any other bank that has such a high exposure to equities? The answer was, of course, no. But before reducing this exposure, we needed to actually have a strategy in place. So first we decided to reduce the risk. So instead of having 100 billion reais in exposure, after all the exercises that we made, we decided to reduce to 30 billion reais of exposure. We cannot do that in 6 months or 3 months. And but we have to do at some point in time. And this, at some point in time, it means 3 years. So BNDES, within the next 3 years, will have to reduce the exposure to equities from 120 billion reais to 30 billion reais. So virtually between 20 and 25 billion dollars of equities exposure reduction within 3 years. Talking about the other agenda at national level, again, the first half of the year, at least in Brazil, and if I were here at this conference 1 year ago, no one would believe that Brazil would deliver the agenda of the pension reform agenda. No one would believe that, I'm sure. But of course, the focus of everyone in the Ministry of Economy was to deliver that agenda, and we delivered. Right after the agenda was delivered, we decided to accelerate the privatizations program. And the first step is to measure how many state-owned entities do we have, and it's a huge number. The Secretary Salim studied this a lot, and he came to the conclusion that Brazil has over 600 companies that are owned in a way by the government, directly or indirectly. And of course, his agenda is to reduce significantly this exposure. We help him. BNDES is the official advisor of the Ministry of the Company to reduce this exposure, their exposure to state-owned entities. And the first thing that we helped them to do was to evaluate which companies would be possible to be sold within the next 3 years. After doing so, we included these companies in the privatizations program of Brazil, and we started by the end of last year to hire consultants, because we never do that alone by ourselves. In most of the cases, we hire external consultants, like for HSBC, for example, which is a bank, could be one of the consultants that we hire to help us to divest the state-owned entities. And we started to hire those consultants by the end of last year, and we're kicking off several projects as we speak. So overall, we started this agenda by the end of last year, and we are accelerating this agenda right now, and we expect to deliver as much as we can within the next 3 years.
Thank you, Leonardo. I just want to remind the audience that we welcome participation throughout this discussion. If you have questions, feel free to raise your hands after we hear opening comments from each of our participants. So please keep that in mind. We'll come to you in a moment, Andrea. Leonardo, I just want to come back to you just to hear a little bit more about the transformation and the role of BNDES. In a process that predates the current administration, but has been massively accelerated. I mean, you talk about your advisory role, BNDES being one of the biggest development banks in the world. How do you characterize the role of the institution today and going forward?
Yeah, BNDES until quite recently had just one focus, which was to provide finance to companies in Brazil, both large companies and small and medium-sized entities. And how was BNDES able to do that? The rates in Brazil were extremely high. It was the case for, as you know, for most of the colleagues that were here a couple minutes ago. But the rates were extremely high. But BNDES had the opportunity to provide finance at lower cost. So there was a significant gap between the actual rates in Brazil and the rates provided by BNDES. It has ended a couple months ago. So nowadays, the cost of funding that BNDES provides is virtually the same that the capital market provides. But was this a problem to Brazil? No. When BNDES no longer provide cheaper financing, the capital markets developed quite rapidly in Brazil. And now they provide much of the financing that the companies need. But at the same time, it doesn't mean that BNDES will no longer be a credit provider. And why is that? BNDES, since its inception, has been focused on analyzing infrastructure projects in Brazil and project finance in general. And I would say nowadays that BNDES is probably one of the most specialized entities in Brazil to analyze projects and to adapt the finance that the projects need to each project. Of course, we'll reduce our exposure to credits. So instead of lending over 100 billion reais per year, nowadays we'll target to lend anywhere between 65 billion reais per year. But of course, it will still be a significant part of BNDES, but focused on development, focused on social, focused on infrastructure and sanitation. And at the same time, since we're in a way reducing a little bit this exposure to credits, we are significantly increasing our services departments.
Thank you. And Leonardo, we'll come back to you with some more detailed questions about the privatization process more generally. Let's come to you, Andrea. Just talk a little bit about Petrobras' role in this agenda. Clearly, the company is entering 2020 with a much more favorable outlook compared to some of the challenges it faced over the past decade. And a large part of that is due to significant divestments over the past year, right? And the company's gone from being one of the most indebted companies in the world, but having made significant progress in deleveraging while improving its earnings profile over the past year. Talk to us a little bit about what's next, what we can expect. I mean, the idea of privatizing Petrobras was unthinkable not very long ago, but it's now actually on the top of everyone's minds when looking at Brazil. There's still a lot of political opposition to the idea of selling Brazil's crown jewels. But just give us your perspective now on the turnaround in fortunes of the company over the past year, and whether it would still be more profitable for the government to go ahead and proceed with such a sale, and what we can expect next.
Okay, thank you for inviting me to be here. It's a pleasure to be here talking about the transformation of Petrobras that has started, I would say, with a big speed in 2019, and it will continue definitely for sure for the next years. So for Petrobras, we have lots of pillars on our strategy, but definitely focus on the higher return assets. It's one of them. In 2019, I would say we were we got some very nice goals implemented. We were able to execute $16 billion of divestments. And those divestments were in many areas, and I'll cover that, and I'll cover the future somehow. But this is part of the I would say the balance that we need to have. We need to focus the company into what we really are good, where we are competitive, and get some money to deleverage the company. So we still have in the third quarter of last year $90 billion of that, so it's still a lot. I would say I would prefer much lower than that. That's the goal is 60, so we are getting there. But definitely we already implemented many things, and maybe just one example of how we were able to turn maybe the low return assets and to invest in high return assets. We used the $16 billion of divestments with some great transactions that I'll comment, and Engie is here that did a very important one with us that was TAG, that represented $8.6 billion of the 16, so it's amazing. we got this money together with generation of cash to be investing in the assets that we believe are the future for Petrobras, assets like Búzios that we were able at the end of the year to bid and to get an assets for $17 billion. If we haven't done our work, if we haven't started the transformation of the company, we wouldn't be able to do so. So we do have to continue divesting, reducing the cost of capital to be able to be competitive in the long run and being able to get the right assets for our portfolio. So that's going to continue. We would be boring. We will be doing the same things moving forward. But divestment is a very important pillar of our strategy. So last year, we had very good examples for that. I would say TAG was one. We had another very good example. That was a privatization of BR done through the capital markets. It was the first privatization of a company done through the capital markets. It was like very organized. We changed bylaws of the company. We changed committees to give really the highest governance that company deserves. We turned into private. We went to the market, and it was very well received. So we were able to get around $2.5 billion out of that. But besides the money that is important to continue deleveraging and focus on the high return assets, it's a remarkable transaction. There was no union complaining outside of B3. So we were very happy. So we were there celebrating in B3, and nobody complained. So very simple, very easy to be done. And why we were able to do so? I think we have the right environment in Brazil right now to talk about privatization or sale of assets. And the Supreme Court last year was maybe the decisions they took around sale of subsidiaries of state-owned companies were really relevant for us to be able to implement what we have been doing so far. So what we see moving forward, we see Brazil changing, and we have lots of assets on E&P, the shallow waters and onshore that we have been selling. That makes a lot of sense to continue to sell because those assets have lifting costs higher than $30 per barrel, and we have pre-sold at $4 per barrel. So those are assets that Petrobras are not the right owner. We are not competitive on those assets. But we find companies like Perenco, like Petronas, like small companies in Brazil. Actually, we are creating a new market for oil and gas, maybe not so big, but medium companies that are able to buy those assets and really extract more value than us. So this is important for Brazil as a whole because those would be investments that we wouldn't be making. So it's not, we won't have money enough to be investing those assets because we cannot generate value out of them. And we are creating another market and employment and other companies that will be investing on those fields. So it's really important for us, and it's important for Brazil. So this is a market that we see, and we still have 11% of our production into that layer. So there's still a lot to come in 2020 around the E&P onshore and shallow waters. We have others. So I think this year to be a transformation year for Petrobras because we are changing maybe one of the markets in Brazil that is the downstream market that nowadays we have 90% of the capacity of that market. So maybe this will be the biggest and really the transformation change that we'll have for Brazil and for Petrobras this year. We are selling 8 refineries, 50% of our capacity. We are in the middle of that process, so we are going to receive some binding proposals by the end of the first quarter. It's moving pretty well. We see lots of demand, so what is amazing, and so downstream market, Brazil is a country that still depends a lot on roads for transportation, so that market is important, and we feel it's the right time to bring competitive to that market. So Petrobras did its own work. Again, what is on our hands, we will do. So everything that can be done in a company, getting the company to be more competitive, we don't need to wait a privatization. We can do it now, and we will be doing whatever is on our hands, Petrobras' responsibility. So we are under the process. So this is the relevant and major process right now. We have been talking and under due diligence with lots of companies interested in those assets. And we believe from those assets, we will have transactions being signed and announced to the market until the end of the year, and closing of those transactions in 2021. Those are assets that are not so easy to be sold because we need to separate those companies. So everything is inside one company that is called Petrobras. We need to create 8 new companies, state-owned, but they will be private in a minute. So don't worry, it's just for a minute. But we will be separate the assets, creating financials, and then really transferring those assets to the new buyer. So this is a major transformation for Brazil. We believe it's important to be competitive. We will need to gain more efficiency in our refineries, the ones that are going to stay in our portfolio, that will be more Rio and São Paulo. And that's the best thing we have to do. So we have investments to make those refineries better, more efficient, able to compete in a new downstream market. If we talk about gas, then there are big changes as well coming to Brazil, and changes that come with divestment of some assets from our portfolio as well. So we did an agreement with the antitrust that Petrobras won't be anymore in the transportation and distribution. And actually, this change started in 2017 when we sold NTS, and last year TAG. So we were already moving out of the transportation of gas in Brazil. So for this year, we have lots of assets in distribution, like Gaspetro, TBG. TBG, there is transportation. We have thermal plants. We don't believe we need to be producing 60% of the thermal power of Brazil. We don't know if Petrobras is really the right company to have those assets. So we believe this has to be gone to the market. We have offshore pipelines that are very important for us. So those very important for us because they are the ones that help us get the gas out of the pre-salt. That is the future for Petrobras. But do we need to do the investments for the futures on the new gas pipelines? Maybe no. So maybe we'll be with some other companies doing those investments. So we need to separate those assets as well. Maybe put them into a company and sell into the market, do an IPO. So we expect that Brazil has a great window, lots of liquidity. That's what we see right now. And we expect that there will be lots of demand, not only for capital markets transactions, but for M&A transactions. And we see that every day. So every day, we have like all the financial support from all the industry. It's amazing how many people is working and how many assets we are selling at the same time. But we see lots of demand. So people are knocking on the door, talking about the assets that are in the portfolio. And again, we are doing the right things, and we are doing what is on our hands. So we can change this company while a state-owned company. We can focus, we can have the right return on assets, we can reduce the debt, we can reduce the cost of debt and the overall cost of funding while it's a state-owned. So let's do whatever is on our hands, and let's wait the government to take any future decisions about the company.
Thank you, Andrea. Raphael, I'll come to you in a second. I just want to ask you, Andrea, as a state-owned company, where does this transformation process end? In other words, what does the transformed Petrobras actually look like while still under state control?
After 2021 or 2022, let's say, we will be focused on deep and ultra-deep water with 5 refineries on the downstream. We'll have some commercialization and processing of gas. We will be producing more gas, definitely in the long run because of pre-salt. We'll definitely be with our debt under a much lower level, and the goal is to reach $60 billion by 2021. After that, we'll be paying more dividends. That I think it's something that we are lagging behind. If we compare ourselves to the big oil companies, 2 things are remarkable. Our leverage, they are AA's, A companies. We don't expect to be an A company in the future. We want to be investment grade again. But definitely for a company that needs lots of capital, and the capital that needs many years to develop a project, we believe the BBB is amazing good. So let's do our work, and let's help Brazil to do its work so as we get together there. So I think we will be a completely different company and a much more competitive and able to compete in the oil and gas global business. That's what we want to be and deliver more value to our shareholders.
Thank you. Raphael, let's come to you. Clearly, as Andrea mentioned, Engie has been heavily involved in the process, having acquired the vast majority of the TAG pipeline. Tell us just a little bit from your perspective as a private investor, what makes Brazil attractive and what makes the privatization process, or the privatization program attractive for an investor such as Engie?
Is that working now? Yes.
Yes.
Okay. So in terms of the attractiveness of Brazil, I'd say that besides the obvious strategic fit that you need to have, a good risk-return profile that we always seek in our investments, and I think it's the same for other investors. I'd like to maybe comment on two factors. One is the confidence that the investors need, and another one is the growth opportunities. In terms of the confidence, we can probably decline this in a couple of items. One is if you look at government walking the talk. It's quite usual for governments to do a lot of talking and not necessarily a lot of walking. I can talk, as a Belgian, it's been a year that we don't have a government, so I speak of experience. So I'm not necessarily here talking about LATAM or Brazil. And I think we've seen the government of Brazil making a lot of talking, but also starting to deliver and do the walking. As Leo was saying, the pension reform is a major step, and that brings a lot of confidence to the investors in respect of Brazil intent to continue to deliver on the important reforms, tax reform, and from our community perspective, also obviously the gas law, changes to the electricity law, changing the issues we have on hydrology, etc. Right. So I think that's the first important point. A second point in terms of confidence is the respect of contracts. It's quite key when you participate to a privatization program that contracts are being respected. Obviously, you will end up with certain links or contracts with the selling party, in terms of you've been acquiring shares, so there'll be certain mutual obligations there. They have to be respected. But you're also likely to end up with a lot of commercial contracts, like, for example, we have in TAG with Petrobras as today, or a single client for that asset. So Brazil has a history of honoring its contracts, and that's very important because we're talking about very large investments here, right, and for the long term. And then, of course, having balanced rules and a fair application of the rules and the law. We have seen in the TAG process, for example, 2 injunctions, and that's fair. I mean, people have a right to do injunctions, but we also were satisfied to see that at the end of the day, like Andrea mentioned, the court did its work and assessed the pros and cons, and eventually decided that the transaction was right for Petrobras, for the country, and that also triggered a lot of confidence in investors in respect of the future privatization, in the sell down of assets owned by publicly owned companies. So I think these are, 3 key factors in terms of confidence. Of course, there are probably more. And then in terms of growth opportunities, there's a lot of capital today chasing projects, good projects, and therefore investors need to focus their time and intention on places of growth, because it's costly, it's time consuming to look at investments, and so I think there's a feeling that when I talk to internally, but also to other investors, there's a lot of interest in Brazil because Brazil offers a lot of growth opportunities. In our own sector, the energy sector, there's still a lot to do in terms of energy transmission. The grid needs to be reinforced. There's a lot of opportunities to continue to install renewable generation, which is good for CO2 emissions. There's a lot of clients asking us to help them on their energy transition, reducing their energy consumption, improving their footprint, being more efficient. So there's a lot of things to be done, and of course, combining these 2 factors, confidence and opportunities, makes Brazil very interesting from an investor perspective, right? So that, I think, covers your first question more or less, right? In terms of the second question, so obviously Engie is no stranger to the privatization scene in Brazil. We entered Brazil through the acquisition of Gerasul in 1998, which was an Petrobras subsidiary. We developed that company. We tripled the size in terms of generation. At the time, I think it represented about 5% of Petrobras. Today, we are the largest privately owned energy generation company in Brazil. We are also owner of a large stake of a gas pipeline that I'll come and talk about. We entered into new businesses, electricity transmission, services for clients. So we hired a lot of people who developed talents. We participated into social programs, environmental programs. So I think we ended up contributing a lot to the energy sector by acquiring that company 20 years ago. And we continued to do that after we acquired about 800 megawatt from CEMIG, state-owned hydro generation assets 2 years ago. Last year we talked about a little bit, we acquired TAG together with CDPQ. So, and we believe that what has happened in the power sector in the last 20 years, we hope to replicate in the gas transportation sector. So we are very hopeful that we can help and transform TAG and grow that company to not just to own one pipeline, but to continue to grow, develop access, help the gas market develop. And so maybe not another example, completely different, but last week we signed our first PPP, so public-private partnership in public lighting. Very different, but also somehow a privatization where the public hands over an asset for, in this case, a city, the lighting to be managed by a private actor. So we're no stranger to privatization, as I was saying. I think perhaps a common factor to the examples I have given in the history of Engie in Brazil is that we like to take majority stakes or control stakes in our investments. And so we are perhaps less interested in a scenario where a privatization comes through IPO with sell down of minority stakes, at least from our perspective as an industrial player. I understand the appeal for financial players, but from an Engie perspective, we are more likely to be on the side of looking at assets where we can have a say. So we're more interested to invest in assets or maybe subsidiaries, or as opposed to taking 10% stake, for example, in the large public-owned electricity company to be privatized, right? So I think this is important.
Thank you. Speaking of 10% stake, Engie is currently considering the purchase of the remaining 10%.
That's another 10%. That was
in the a different 10%.
It's a different, of course. Of course.
But what can we expect in that process, and what would be a fair price for such a stake?
Everybody has their view on what a fair price will be, and we all read the press that I think Petrobras, of course, is running a process. I'm expecting that there will be, of course, a lot of people interested because it's a great asset, because you have a great 90% owner, right? But we are also very interested to participate, and we do hope to buy the remaining stakes, to be in control of our destiny together with CDPQ and see what we do with the asset. But we welcome the process. It has just started. Non-binding offers are due in 2 weeks from now, so may the best win.
Thank you. I just want to break for a moment, see if there are any questions in the audience before we continue with the discussion. Okay. Well, let's come back to you, Leonardo. Let's talk a little bit about factors that may. I mean, we've heard kind of eloquently from Raphael about some of the factors which are appealing for a company of that sort. But let's talk a little bit about factors which could weigh on investor sentiment towards Brazilian markets and indeed the privatization process more generally. Looking at 2020, what concerns you most? Looking at both the internal environment and the external environment, we heard on the last panel a whole range of certainly external risks, but what concerns you most about maintaining the pace that's needed also to keep the confidence in the process?
Well, of course, the external market is always a concern For BNDES, sometimes we follow the capital markets option because we have, in general, have minority stakes. So as Raphael mentioned, they're not the core interest for companies like Engie, and we need to follow the capital markets. And we always depend on the capital markets at the point that we're selling. So we will have to match offer and demand. So if the capital market is not there, of course, we'll not be able to sell. But if there is significant demand, then there's interest from BNDES side to dispose a stock, for example, then we'll continue and proceed with the offer or selling the market. Internally, what concerns me most is that we should deliver. As Raphael also mentioned, there can be a lot of talk, but if we do not deliver, then the whole project is over. And in addition to talking, and like we're talking right now, and saying what we're planning to do over next year, what I expect to do is to come back here next year and said, I delivered 8, 10 auctions that I was planning to do last year, and they have been delivered. And it depends on the market also, but also depends on ourselves. Depends on BNDES, depends on the process that we're organizing, depends on the public entities that you always need their help, of course, when we are planning to sell a state-owned entity. And if we all work together, we'll be able to deliver. If we don't, then it would not be possible. In terms of the rules of law in Brazil, the decision of the Supreme Court last year was extremely important because it gave us comfort for all of the state-owned companies to run our processes. And for the privatizations program, there is a law that has been there for almost 30 years. And we follow the law, and there are injunctions as more than 2. Sometimes we receive over 100 injunctions in one single project. But since we're following the law and respecting the law, we respond to these injunctions, and they're not, in general, they're not a real problem for us.
Right. I mean, you yourself said at the beginning that there are over 600 state-owned companies that could ultimately submit to this process, but only a fraction of those so far have been announced. What can we expect in the coming year in terms of the pace of this process picking up, in terms of the number of projects and targets being announced?
600, over 600 includes both directly owned, which are 48 in Brazil, and indirectly. So including the indirectly owned, we're talking about over 600. Only Petrobras, for example, it's almost 200 entities that Petrobras own. And if you sell Petrobras, at the same time you're selling over 200 companies. Right now, out of the 48 companies that are, I'll focus on those companies that are directly owned by the governments, 16 are included in the program, and we don't expect much more to be included, maybe in the next years, but we need to deliver these 16. So our focus is to deliver what we have in our pipeline right now.
And do you think that there's, assuming the success of the federal program to date, is there a likelihood that this will speed up similar initiatives at the state level?
It is already. In addition to the companies that we have at the federal level, national level, that is at BNDES portfolio, and they have both distribution and generation, so we can attract interest from several potential buyers. We will, Andrea mentioned quite briefly that there will be a significant gas transformation in Brazil. And most of the companies the gas distribution companies in Brazil are still state-owned. And right now we have 2 companies in our portfolio already in the process of being sold. And I am personally discussing with virtually all of the governors in Brazil about the gas companies and the potential that they have, and talking to them about privatizing the gas companies. So I expect much more activity from the subnational companies going forward.
Thank you. Andrea, just to come to you with a similar question to what I just asked Leonardo about the factors that you think could weigh on investor sentiment looking ahead to 2020, and what concerns you most, whether it's the internal environment or the external environment?
I will answer similar to Leonardo. I believe what we need to do is execute. So as I mentioned, let's say refineries. The most important thing and strategic thing for Petrobras, and one of the reasons why we are selling the refinery is because we believe in the long run this will reduce the possible future interference of the government into pricing of fuel. So what we need to do is execute. We need to sell them. So if there is the right demand, if there are really companies that are willing to buy those companies, we need to execute, and we need to execute fast, because that window of time doesn't stay forever. We know Brazil is a country happy to see what is happening right now, happy to see the growth of the country and all the reforms that are coming. But definitely we need to execute. We need to do it. That we do have flexibility to mitigate those risks. We do have some assets that are more liquid than others that we can include in the portfolio, and we'll be doing so because it's really important for us to reach our goals, and deleverage is one of them. But the right environment helps. So somehow all the risks that we see outside of Brazil, I think might impact even the demand from the companies to buy our assets. So whenever there is a window of opportunity, we need to take it, and that's what we are doing, and that's why 19 was so strong, and that's why 2020 we need to be better than 2019. Actually, we need to execute more. We are doing so it's exactly on our plans. I would say we don't expect any big risks on the development of the oil and gas deep and ultra deep waters that we have. I think actually on that front, we believe we have set a base of production that is going to help Petrobras grow for the future. And we really definitely bought some assets that are going to help us on our reserves. So on that front, I believe we have ANP has been helping. We do have some negotiations right now with the PPSA after we did the excess of the transfer rights bids to approve the projects for Búzios. But it's amazing the perspective that we see from a field like Búzios. So there are risks, but there are risks that there are mitigation risks for them. And we will apply all possible mitigations or divestments, including other assets in the portfolio, or in the case of ENP, like trying to anticipate things, trying to discuss things with the regulators and with the companies involved faster, so as we get to the final decisions and the final investment decisions as fast as we can. I think that's somehow what we have to do.
Great, thank you. Raphael, just to come to you and sort of get your sense of what role local capital markets can play in supporting the process and the local debt markets as well, in supporting the privatization process.
I think both equity capital market and debt capital market in Brazil have been doing very well. Of course, last year was exceptional in terms of equity capital market. I think almost 50 transactions, like 100 billion reais raised. So it was a record year for almost a decade. We expect this to continue this year, so which is great news for companies going to the market, for stakes being sold down, like BNDES will be doing, and for companies who are in the market and who are in need of more money to fund their projects, maybe like Engie, right? In terms of the debt capital market, we've seen a little bit of closure locally in the last months because of the reference interest rates being so low that investors are not used or accustomed to getting such low yields for fixed income. So either they'll have to get used to it or the market will change, I don't know. But we do count on the debt capital market locally to fund our projects. There's still a need of the BNDES quite a lot, and Engie does work a lot with the BNDES because BNDES provides long-term financing, which the local market is starting to do, but with limited volume still. So we still do rely heavily on BNDES. We've been working with the BNDES for many years. We're extremely satisfied with our relationship, and we would like sometimes that the terms and conditions be a bit more sponsors friendly, but we are working with the BNDES to try and achieve balanced positions. But in general, we are pretty pleased. So we would like to see more local markets availability in terms of depth and tenor, which is crucial for long-term investments. So that's what we hope Brazil will deliver. Yeah.
Great. We just have a couple of minutes left. I want to see if any questions from the audience. I have a question, back row.
Hi, thank you. Turns on. It is? Oh, hi, thank you for your remarks. I have two questions, and I think you guys pointed out very important remarks in terms of delivery and execution, and I think that has been an issue in Brazil for many years. I think tax reform, pension reform was a key event. Tax reform now might be the next. But as you both mentioned, execution and delivery is key. I think the STF, as you mentioned, Leonardo, was the decision last year was a key event for you guys, especially for privatization, right? But still we have some challenges like unions. So how you see unions and resistance and social impact impacting your agenda for delivery, your plans this year? And for instance, if there is one or two that get stuck for those reasons, how you plan to continue forward to deliver the agenda this year? You switch, like you advance in another one, you stop that one, and you put that one on hold so you can deliver, as you mentioned? And my second question is relates to infrastructure bonds, right? We have been hearing this for years. The government comes here, make presentations about infrastructure bonds. And one of the hurdles, and I think that was before you joined BNDES, was how the bonds international investors will be treated relative to BNDES in terms of pari passu, and that BNDES would be willing to share the pari passu in terms of seniority with international holders. So how you see that going forward?
Yeah, I'll start by the last question, but I'll ask Andrea's help on the first one, because she's been delivering, and union could be a problem for her. I'm not sure if it was actually a problem or not. But in the second question, in terms of finance, as Raphael mentioned, BNDES still is an important credit provider, especially in the long-term credit. But what we approved by the end of last year, we are starting to implement, is that instead of being a single provider of credit, so BNDES will always intend to syndicate its loan. So instead of being the single one, we'll actually like to have co-investors with us, 50%, 40%, the amount to be defined, but to have co-investors. And when it happens, the problem of seniority is solved, because we will be all together in the same loan. We are aiming to implement that still this year. So talking and executing, a lot of talking, but then we define a product. Now we want to implement this product this year. Getting back to the first question in terms of unions, it is a problem for privatizations. I cannot say it is not a problem. For example, I'm privatizing right now. We just kicked off the banknotes company in Brazil, which is still a state-owned company. And the union of this entity, of course, they complain. But at the same time, I explain that if don't do anything with this company, what's going to happen next? And I'll take Petrobras as an example. If don't help Petrobras to receive more funds and make the investments that Petrobras needs, what's going to happen with Petrobras going forward? And this is the discussion that we're having with the unions, and we do believe that it is in the benefit of the company. Forget about the fiscal problems in Brazil, but when we privatize a company, it's also in the benefit of the company. And these discussions have been being quite productive so far. But I'll ask Andrea to comment about the privatizations that she already delivered.
So in our case, I believe the Supreme Court decision was really the trigger not to have impacts from unions, because before we had injunctions for everything. Every process had lots of injunctions. So if the judges were accepting their complaints, then the whole process was really stopped. After they saw that there won't be support for the complaints, I believe we were like clean up our, I would say, our the divestment program, and we were able to execute everything. I'm not saying that it's solved, that there's no pressure from unions. Actually, what we have been trying is to communicate that the divestment of companies in Brazil is not bad for Brazil, because actually in some areas we are creating opportunities for other companies to develop and create more jobs than us. So I think that's important as well. I think this communication, and not just for the unions, but for our own employees, we are doing a very direct conversation. Actually, we are doing every week the leadership, the total executive board, together with CEO, with the full leadership of Petrobras, once a week, 1 hour, to send some message, because it's important to show them that the cases that we are selling those assets, there are companies that are investing much more. So they are creating more jobs than we would be able to create. I think this is important as well for people to see. It doesn't have to be state-owned. It was state-owned because of decisions taken in the past. But right now, there are a much better perspective for some of those companies in some of those fields, even in EIP, to be developed by other companies. So, but communication, transparency, I think that's really a lot important as well.
You can just give an example of, ourselves, Engie. If you look at, I said, we were a publicly owned company 20 years ago. This was bought, and we transformed the company. We created a lot of jobs, lots of opportunities. We distributed a lot of money to the shareholders. We are paying our employees well. We have workers' representative at the board. So we have unions. Unions have the role to play, and I think they don't need to be ostracized necessarily. I think if everyone is playing their role properly, you can have a constructive discussion and relationship with your unions, and for the benefit of all. So I think privatization is often inducing fear, because you are going to change from one entity to another. But if this is for the better good and to create opportunities for the company to grow, it will be beneficial to the workers and the employees. So, there are good examples available.
Thank you for your comments. With great regret, I have to say that we're going to have to wrap this up. We could go on for hours. I know we all have other pressing engagements, but I really want to just thank you all for an excellent discussion and for sharing your perspectives and your insights with our audience here and our international audience via our video feed. So thanks once again. Please join me in thanking our panelists for an excellent discussion.